Hello SGD, and this is the Iraivan Temple in Hawaii. It's a granite Hindu temple, the only granite Hindu temple in the USA, uh, made mostly with traditional techniques. There were, especially in the sacred precinct, outside not so much, but inside, the traditional craftsmen who were either working in India where the stone was sourced, and the final Shilpi stonemasons working at the temple themselves. Beautiful sculpture and architecture, but the point of the video is to look at the philosophy of ancient temple design and how from east to west this is something of a constant. There are certain themes that keep going through the temple, and so it also has to do with the units of measure for the temple, and that uh, just like the Parthenon and other places, there is a unit derived from multiple factors which is specific to the temple, but it also needs to correspond to the temple as a whole, the concept of the temple of man, which again was described in ancient architectural texts such as that of the 10 Books of Architecture by Vitruvius. So we're just going to hear the gentleman who's giving a tour, and he's going to talk about this, and we'll stop along the way and just add a few points, but it's the way that these things work together, and it's not as standardized as what you might think. It's sort of a follow-on from the last video. I was looking at the ancient meter. Was it modern or was it ancient? So let's hear him talk and describe the process of designing the temple and creating the measurements and the proportions which go to make this temple and this ancient philosophy of architecture, especially architecture in sacred buildings, sacred spaces.
And what the studies call is the ayadi compatibility. You actually, just like a couple going to get married, you check compatibility. When you build a temple, you do a compatibility. It's called ayadi calculation. The study did teach me a little bit of his family secret. Not much, just a little. I have to really work hard at it. In this case, the deity Shiva has a nakshatra, Ardra, of course. And then the founder or the major donor of the temple generally, or the president, in this case founder, Gurudeva, and his nakshatra, which is Shravana, and the nakshatra for the syllable Ka, which is Kauai, and I don't know what that is. They put all this together, they find one nakshatra that's compatible with these three nakshatras.
In the 10 Books of Architecture, or De Architectura, by the Roman engineer architect Vitruvius, which covered many times in regards to the Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, Vitruvian Man. But he talks about the concepts of temple design, symmetry of a temple corresponding to the parts of a human body, but he'll also talks about astronomy, about how different, so a temple for a female goddess should have different attributes, one to a male god, and very similar themes to what you'll hear this person discussing the Iraivan temple is talking about as well.
And the nakshatra for the syllable Ka, which is Kauai, and I don't know what that is. They put all this together, they find one nakshatra that's compatible with these three nakshatras. So that's the first qualification. Then, each nakshatra, not all of them out of 27, I think about 20 of them has numerical values. And that value in a traditional, I guess, Indian measurement system. And they have to convert that to modern inches. So you take that measurement, and then you see if that fits your criteria. For example, Kauai, as a rule, you can't build anything higher than 40 feet tall. That's the county ordinance. So somebody came with about 60 feet, and we said, no, you can't do this. So he goes back to find another nakshatra, would give him a measurement that would qualify for this measurement. So once you have the measurement, they crunch, there's a 16 compatibility they have to check. I forgot the names, the 16 of them, they have to compare, make sure this measurement fits this, fits this, fits that, fits that. And the measurement for Iraivan temple is 11 feet, 7¼ inches. So everything you see here is modulated by that measurement. They call it ganda. That's what stability said. When the temple is carved and built according to that, even before the consecration, it will bring the divinity into it. Because the temple itself is a form of a gross linga. The Shiva temple is a 5 linga. The sanctum, the tower, the Balipidam, the flagpole, and the presiding priest. The Sivacharya himself is the 5th Shiva linga. So we call it Panchalinga Valipana, worship of 5 lingas at any given point in Shiva temple. So that's why the sanctum itself becomes so sacred when it's built correctly. So that's for the temple. And Iraivan, every single portion you see, based on that modular measurement. However, the Shastras did not define where you draw the lines, center to center, inner to inner, or outer to outer. For example, you can take it from the center to center here, and Iraivan, every single portion you see, based on that modular measurement. However, the Shastras did not define where you draw the lines, center to center, inner to inner, or outer to outer. For example, you can take it from the center to center here, 11 feet 7 1/4, or inside to inside, or outside to outside.
So in review, there are many important things that and connections that will come from this, because it's not just about Indian architecture, it's about how it applies to ancient Western architecture and how that legacy has been passed on to modern times. But he talks about the Nakshatra, or the lunar mansion. We must consider the deity, the builder or sponsor of the building, as well as the location of the building. These must all be considered. Once all these features are considered, we must consider and find a single compatible nakshatra or lunar mansion. Deity, builder, and location must be brought into this. And because the nakshatras have a sacred number attached to them, we can then find a single compatible number, which they then use to find a single compatible system of measure from which all of the elements of a temple are derived. So temple proportions and units are key. Now, for instance, as I mentioned there, the original design would have been just at about 63 feet high. Because of the local regulations there, buildings should not be higher than the palm trees, and so they had to reduce that and have it at 40 feet or below. A change in the height required a complete redesign. Length and width and height also had to be adjusted. And with that redesign, again, they had to consider all of the factors, bring them back in together, and then it was found that the temple measurement was 11 feet 2 1/4 inches, or just over 3.5 meters. And every single portion of the temple is reflected in that model measurement. He also points out that the Vastu Shastru, this ancient Indian principles of architecture, doesn't specifically define whether it's the inside of a column, the middle of a column, or the outside of a column. So again, it had to be designed in such a way that this proportion based on this measurement must reflect in all of those features. It's very complicated. So we come back to the Parthenon. It has to do with symmetry and very calculations which on their own are quite difficult, but again they have to include multiple layers of consideration. So the Hindu elements had to be brought in there, but we can see the Parthenon. Now again, the famous image Vitruvian Man by Da Vinci is based on the Roman description by Marco Vitruvius in his 10 books of architecture, symmetry of a temple and in proportions of the human body, symmetry in the temple, in temples and of the human body. So he's saying again, this was an ancient Roman writer, and he later says that this principle was practiced by the ancients, so ancient Romans who were ancient to them, they were doing the same principles as well. So Corinthian, Doric and Ionic, it's not just the column design that's important, it's also the proportions of the column and the larger temple design. So just because it has a Doric column doesn't, there are strict rules for Doric, Ionic and Corinthian. It has to do with decorations, proportions and other factors, but that this tradition, so Freemason, tracing board, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, it's very important in these esoteric groups. And we'll see in a moment, this is a Salamis stone. It's partially obscured, but I'll put the links to Mark Wilson-Jones talking about this. The Salamis stone is one of these classical ancient examples of a conversion tool where multiple sets of measurement are incorporated on a single piece, so that different masons working from different regions who would have a different foot could find the proportions, like set their dividers and their tools, and everyone's working off the same script in that way. But the real beauty of it is, and the example would be the height of a Parthenon. It also works with the width of a Parthenon in a different set of measurements that are harmonized because of the width, but the height, so from the bottom of a column to the top of the frieze or architrave, but from, just let's call it the ceiling where it hangs over, that is 48 of these common feet. So probably it's a bit obscure, but there's a foot imprinted there. And then we have the Doric and the Ionic, but it's 48 common feet, which essentially is an English foot, 45 Doric or 50 Ionic. With a conversion tool, it could have been 50.5 Ionic feet, but the real beauty of it is that it brings all of these together, and that's a good thing for practical. But there's another layer of that. We'll come to that in a moment. Okay, so Vitruvian Man, that's the Salamis stone superimposed on the top. You can see even how the foot there corresponds with that circle, and there are other features that just correspond very well. So man is the measure of all things, these different scales of measurement back to the Parthenon, and so that height of 48 common feet, 50 Doric, 45 Doric, sorry, or 50 Ionic. Just on the common scale, like for instance 192 in regards to Pythagorean tuning, but again these sacred numbers such as 144, but also 720 and 540. If you're familiar with, these numbers will jump out, but also that they've harmonized and they're whole units. So everyone sort of will usually think feet or inches, but digits or fingers are just actually more important. You could forget the inch, think more in fingers. But above there we have the triglyphs and the metopes or metopes, but the triglyph as in tri, we can see there, and then the distance between them is the metope, or I'll say metope. But the triglyph in itself forms one module. Again, this is described in Vitruvius, how this must be proportioned in a certain scale. And so one triglyph is 1.5 metopes, and so one triglyph plus a metope is 2.5 nodules, and that corresponds to 1 Parthenon yard or 3 Parthenon feet. Again, I'll link these in the description, but Anee Bulckens is talking about this, and again we see the triglyphs with the gaps between being the metope or metope, and by studying, and she's derived that the Parthenon foot is 343.04 millimeters. That converts to, so 3 of those is a Parthenon yard or 2.5 modules. And so well, you can confirm this because that measurement derived from these, which again is described in ancient texts how you should do this, corresponds to the larger temple. Smaller piece to the largest, like the symmetry of the temples and the human. Each part should be in corresponding units and also proportion. So she says we take that Parthenon foot, which is unique to that temple, just like the Iraivan temple, and that it corresponds to the larger proportions of the building. Now, many other people studying this have noticed that there are certain key proportions that link the Parthenon, the width to the height, and the height to the length, and these type of features. And that 4:6:9 ratios, it's a 2 to 3. It's a 2 to 3. That's a perfect fifth in Pythagorean music. And so, for instance, the Parthenon length is 9 to the width 4. Width is 9 to the height 4. And so we see that 4 to 9. And, well, 2 to 3. Well, 4 to 9 is 4 squared to 3 squared. That's an important feature because it's not just about the length, the height, the width in these things. It's how this beautiful harmony comes together at very specific, very important harmonic numbers over the larger scale. So again, I'll link this one, Anee Bulckens. It's by Jay Kapraff, but she's incorporating both. And I'll put this link, Symmetry. I reposted this on my own channel. The original link will be there because it's Jay Kapraff is talking about connections between the Parthenon and Indian architectural traditions. So. But we have, like, for instance, the harmonic numbers. These are just from those papers, and it has to do, so D is a dactyl, and that's just another word for finger. So 16 fingers make a foot, 12 inches or thumbs make a foot, based on idealized proportions such as Vitruvian Man. But if you see D, that just means fingers, and it is much more, much better to think in 16 fingers per foot rather than 12 inches per foot. But again, we'll see, so the areas in the temple themselves, so 144, 96, 24, like, again, it's just all these 216, and all these very important harmonic numbers, because you can also use this to get the ideal Pythagorean tuning, but it's just, it's music. It is geometry is music. Another Frank Albo studied this building in great detail, took measurements of it, and amongst all the lovely numbers, especially if you use if you convert them to fingers, ounces and stuff. Not ounces, inches. All the harmonic number, 108, 288, 144, they're all embedded in there. But the building itself is a 2 to 3 ratio, or the Hermetic constant, and so important in music theory. And again, we see these inherent, the lovely numbers that go to music, and that 2 to 3, which derives the Vesica. Now, that's how we had written in the past, and then you can go to, even if it's not a nice big ISBN document, what happens is that we can observe these practices still being going on. I would love to there are a number of Harvey, Wiley, Corbett. I've mentioned him many times in the past. He's one of these architects who's doing these things on the measures, harmonic scale, and coming together. But he also designed George Washington National Masonic Memorial in Alexandria in Virginia. But there's also the Parthenon was a inspiration that was added to the design, as well as the Lighthouse of Pharos, and there's all lovely number of proportions going on in there. But when it comes to, obviously this is only as accurate as what I can do. It's not perfect, but by taking the metope and then taking the triglyph and then half the triglyph, we see it's very close to 1.5. I could have adjusted the image, of course, slightly, but that this practice is going on, and if it's very difficult to get precise surveys of these buildings without spending a lot of money really to go into that, resources I don't have. But we see that 1 to 1.5, and that there are, I would suggest that this would correspond to a unit of measurement that's going to divide this building up along very musical proportions, and the small would divide the whole, and not just on its own because of who it's dedicated to, the art, but it's the architect. And you'll see these, I just followed certain architects along, and they're always practicing the same features. Another example would be like a Buzier. He was an inspiration for Oscar Niemeyer, who designed the UN building in New York, but also Brasilia, which is just another, whether it's Washington DC, Canberra, ACT Australia, Brasilia, Federal District Brazil, or Astana in capital of Kazakhstan, where Norman Foster appears both for the building design and for the larger city design. But the concept of the modular and proportions, how they connect. So this is a famous image of modern times, but it is a hidden practice, let's say. Well, actually not hidden, just not well known. So just like the Parthenon, the Iraivan Temple has a unique measurement to it. I'd love to get more very accurate data on Iraivan Temple, but the Parthenon also harmonizes multiple sets of measures at very specific, very beautiful numbers. So temples will vary be designed to harmonically embody sacred numbers across multiple sets of units of measurement. Temples will be designed upon a unit of measurement unique to that temple. Temples will be designed in such a genius fashion as to balance the unique and the common systems of measurement. And this applies to cathedrals as well. We'd have to study all of them, but this is St. Saviour's in Goulburn. So there we have the basic elements of this, but again from Eastern to Western, ancient right through up to the modern period. The philosophy behind architecture, temple design, cathedral design is one that incorporates many features, and there is a commonality between these. Now, whether they derive from an earlier original source and had slight deviations, whether they developed separately and just happen to come together, and again to incorporate the use of sacred numbers 144, 108, etc. I think would put it more in that at least there was, even if they began as individual separate methods and philosophies, that there was an interchange in where they started to have these common threads. But that's even not really important overall. The fact is that there are still architects practicing this, whether it's for Hindu temples, for modern public buildings and so forth, and that at the very least we can trace these back to Greco-Roman times, because for instance connections between Greek and Indian traditions is very, very strong. I think it might have been around about the time of Pythagoras or Plato, which was just as Buddhism was beginning, there was a movement to shift the Greek religions to Buddhism as well. I'll try, but there are similarities, and for all of the things that can be interpreted and are up for question when it comes to things such as measurement and proportion, these are tangible, testable, and very observable. And so when it comes to this, there are a lot of layers that goes into it. There's the genius of the builders themselves, but when it also comes to the way that the architects were able, just as the masons do this fantastic work with the stone, there's also this intellectual layer of the architects bringing in all these features and fitting them in so precisely, so carefully, and it's to my eye, I think it's so beautiful, the architecture, just aesthetically to look at it. But when you see the depth that goes into it, into sacred numbers, sacred places, the importance of sacred geometry is, again, which is a modern term, but the concept is an ancient one, that they're in the geometry, in the metrology, in the dedication, in the philosophy, spiritual beliefs that also go into these things, as well as the quadrivium, which of course includes geometry, but as well as music, astronomy, and arithmetic. There's many, many layers that go on there, and images so iconic such as Vitruvian Man contain depth, knowledge, um, a very important, genius balanced, multi-layered system. So anyway, with that, have a good one. Measure, measure.